The Catholic Church once controlled nearly a third of all farmland in Western Europe. This was not merely a spiritual empire, but the single largest landowner of its age, a financial powerhouse built on faith. The story of how belief was woven into a vast economic network is one of the most fascinating in history. You will discover the precise financial mechanisms that turned spiritual devotion into a lasting empire of wealth. How did a religious institution amass more land and riches than kings? What hidden economic systems operated behind the stained glass windows of cathedrals? This journey uncovers the contributions that funded kingdoms, the banking innovations born in monasteries, and the art that served as both devotion and investment. We will trace the flow of spiritual capital from the peasant's field to the papal treasury. By the end, you will see the medieval world through an entirely new lens, understanding how faith constructed the foundations of modern finance. What does it truly take for an idea to build an empire that lasts 1,000 years? The rhythm of medieval life was measured in seasons and sacraments, and at its core lay a simple, profound obligation. Picture a family after a long year of labor, carefully separating 1/10 of their grain, one lamb from every 10 in their small flock. This was the tithe, a sacred duty that transformed faith into a tangible economic force. Across thousands of villages, this same scene played out, creating a river of wealth that flowed directly into the church. Mandated by scripture and reinforced by long-standing custom, this 10% levy on all produce and earnings formed the unshakable foundation of the entire ecclesiastical economy. Economic historians point out that this system was revolutionary in its consistency. Unlike the irregular taxes imposed by kings for wars or projects, the tithe was perpetual and predictable. It was collected year after year in times of peace and conflict, in years of bounty and in years of hardship. This created a stable, continuous revenue stream that no secular power could match. The enforcement was both spiritual and practical. To withhold the tithe was not merely a breach of local law, it was considered a spiritual failing, a powerful deterrent that ensured near universal compliance. Local priests acted as the frontline collectors of this vast system, storing the grain, wool, and other goods in massive, specialized structures known as tithe barns. Many of these barns still stand today, their vast, cavernous interiors a silent testament to the sheer volume of resources that passed through them. But not all of these goods stayed locally. A portion was always sent up the chain, flowing from the parish priest to the bishop, and from the bishop onward to the papal court in Rome. This redistribution system funded everything from local community aid to the grand cathedrals rising in distant cities. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, offers a stunning snapshot of this integration. It meticulously records not just manors and mills, but also the land and assets owned by the church, treating it as a fundamental pillar of the feudal economy. The church was not separate from the state. It was a state within a state, with its own income and its own power base. Can you fathom a single modern institution commanding a mandatory 10% of global income, year after year, with the weight of spiritual tradition backing its claims? This relentless, systematic gathering of resources from every level of society created the church's first and most critical asset, an unimaginable expanse of land. If you were to look at a map of medieval Europe, it would slowly bloom with vast territories marked as churchland. This was not merely property, it was the very definition of influence in an age where land was the ultimate currency. Through a steady and multifaceted campaign of growth, the church secured its position as the paramount steward of territory across the Western world. The methods were as varied as they were effective. Wealthy nobles, reflecting on their spiritual future, would sign over entire villages and sprawling forests to monastic houses in detailed charters, hoping to secure a lasting legacy. One such document from 11th century France records a count offering a tract of land so expansive it took a rider 2 days to cross, all as an expression of faith and devotion. This was the economy of spiritual commitment in its purest form, where earthly resources were exchanged for enduring meaning. Beyond these personal offerings, land was also acquired through strategic grants on the frontiers. Kings would entrust untamed wilderness to orders like the Cistercians, effectively inviting them to undertake the demanding work of cultivating forests, draining marshes, and establishing farms. In return, the monarchy gained a settled, productive territory and the cultural standing that came from supporting a respected order. The Church became a master of turning open landscapes into lasting prosperity. Managing these extensive estates required thoughtful innovation. Monastic orders established outlying farms known as granges, run not by ordained monks but by a workforce of lay brothers and local workers. These agricultural centers were models of careful planning, generating significant revenue from crops, timber, and even resources drawn from beneath the soil. The Cistercians, in particular, became celebrated for their agricultural vision. They sought out quiet valleys others saw as overlooked and transformed them into thriving sheep farms. Their activities grew so extensive that they helped reshape the European economy, producing wool on a remarkable scale and building trade connections that reached across the continent. From the quiet reflection of a monk's daily rhythm to the bustling exchange of the international wool market, the Church's economic presence was interwoven with daily life. Consider the profound social influence that came from this territorial stewardship. To be the primary landholder for millions of people meant you shaped not just their food and shelter, but their daily work and community ties. This was a form of authority that could stand alongside any royal power, and with such widespread assets to oversee, the need for a more thoughtful approach to administration became increasingly clear. The sheer scale of this land ownership required an operational framework of immense efficiency, and it was found in the rhythm of the manor. As autumn's golden light fell across the fields, teams of peasants worked from sunrise to sunset, their scythes swinging in unison to bring in the harvest. The grain they reaped, however, did not all return to their own homes. A substantial portion was destined for the massive granaries of the local monastery or abbey, filling storerooms that secured the community against the coming winter. This was the manorial system in action, the sophisticated engine that transformed vast territories into sustainable, generation-spanning wealth. Each manor functioned as a largely self-sufficient economic world, where the Church, as the lord of the estate, held ultimate control over production, justice, and daily life. Historians note that this system provided unparalleled food security for the religious community, freeing them from the uncertainties of the open market. But more than that, it consistently generated a massive surplus that could be sold or traded, creating the liquid capital that fueled the Church's broader ambitions. The success of this system hinged on careful agricultural planning and a structured labor force. Many estates employed a 3-field rotation system, a revolutionary approach for its time. Instead of exhausting the soil by planting the same crop every year, fields were cycled between a winter grain like wheat, a spring grain like barley or oats, and a year of lying fallow to recover its nutrients. This simple but brilliant practice dramatically increased overall yields, ensuring a more reliable harvest. The labor that powered this productivity came from serfs, peasants bound to the land. In exchange for their own small strips of land to farm, They owed a set number of workdays each week to till, sow, and harvest the church's own reserved fields, known as the demesne. Disputes over obligations, land boundaries, and local matters were settled not in a royal court, but in the manor's own court, presided over by the abbot's appointed steward, weaving the church's authority into the very fabric of local governance. From these carefully managed lands flowed a river of commodities. Grains like wheat and barley formed the dietary and economic backbone. Monastic vineyards produced wines for both sacrament and sale, while vast flocks of sheep grazing on upland pastures supplied wool, a cash crop of immense value in the medieval textile trade. The scale of these operations could be staggering. Consider the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny. At the peak of its influence, it did not merely oversee a single estate but a sprawling network of over 1,000 individual manors. This made Cluny not just a spiritual center, but one of the largest and most sophisticated economic enterprises in all of Europe, its influence echoing from its grand basilica down to the most remote field. Does a prayer recited in a quiet chapel become more powerful when spoken from a position of such profound material security? The surplus wealth generated by these thousands of manors created a new challenge, a flood of capital that now needed not just storage, but sophisticated management and strategic growth. The steady rhythm of coins dropping into a collection chest echoed through the nave, a sound as familiar to medieval worshippers as the chanting of the Mass. This was the sound of spiritual currency, a direct and powerful system where faith met finance at the very doors of the church. Beyond the steady income from land, the church perfected the art of generating revenue from religious services themselves, creating a market for the most intangible of commodities, salvation. The most famous and controversial of these practices was the sale of indulgences. The underlying theology was complex, rooted in the concept of a treasury of merit. This was understood as an infinite reservoir of grace built up by the sacrifices of holy figures, a spiritual surplus that the Church, as its steward, could dispense to the faithful. In practice, this was translated into a way to support the work of the Church while receiving a spiritual acknowledgement. A professional class of representatives known as pardoners traveled from town to town, offering these spiritual agreements. They were often charismatic performers, dramatically presenting scrolls and relics to lend authority to their message. One critic, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther, would later famously question how such a transaction could truly address matters of conscience, asking if the resources gathered from such efforts were not a greater priority than building a basilica. Defenders of the practice framed it not as a purchase, but as a charitable contribution that demonstrated genuine repentance, with the indulgence being a spiritual recognition for that act of giving. This system reached its peak with a massive campaign to fund the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, an architectural marvel supported largely by the widespread distribution of these spiritual certificates. But indulgences were just one thread in a vast tapestry of monetized devotion. Families would support priests to say specific masses for the memory of those who came before, with contributions often scaled to the elaborateness of the service. Pilgrimages to sacred sites like Canterbury or Rome became a massive industry, generating support not just from donations at the shrines, but from the entire economy of travel, lodging, and the sale of souvenir badges. The line between an act of pure piety and a financial transaction became increasingly blurred. Can you comprehend the psychological power of a system that connected material support with hopes for spiritual peace? This constant flow of coins and offerings, gathered from the hopes and concerns of millions, created a financial torrent that needed to be channeled, counted, and protected. The sheer volume of this spiritual commerce demanded a revolutionary system for managing the wealth it generated, A cathedral's foundation was not merely stone and mortar, it was a mountain of coin. Raising these breathtaking structures required a financial engine as complex as the vaulted ceilings themselves, turning acts of faith into the largest economic stimulus projects of the medieval world. Architectural historians have calculated that the cost of a single major cathedral could equal the entire annual economic output of a prosperous town, a burden that could financially engage a bishopric for generations. The funding model was brilliantly multifaceted, drawing from every level of society and every corner of the church's vast treasury. Wealthy noble families and powerful craft guilds would sponsor specific elements, like a stained glass window or a side chapel, their donations securing both spiritual prestige and a permanent public advertisement of their status. Direct revenues from church lands and tithes provided a steady baseline of capital, while special collection chests were placed in parishes across a diocese, inviting the small but countless contributions of the common people. Bishops themselves sometimes embarked on fundraising tours, passionately advocating for their projects in distant regions to gather the necessary resources. The story of Chartres Cathedral offers a powerful illustration. After a fire damaged the older structure, the entire community was mobilized in a collective effort. Nobles contributed vast sums, merchants offered materials, and peasants pledged their labor, hauling stone and supplies in a dramatic display of shared purpose that wove the cathedral's creation directly into the social and economic life of the region. Can any modern community muster a comparable economic unity for a single, transcendent goal that would outlive them all by centuries? Beyond the spiritual payoff, the construction site itself was a hive of economic activity. For decades, even a century or more, it employed thousands of skilled workers, masons carving intricate figures, carpenters shaping massive timbers, and glassmakers transforming sand and metal into glowing biblical scenes. This demand stimulated entire industries, from the quarrying of limestone to the felling of ancient forests for lumber. Once completed, the cathedral did not simply become a place of worship. It transformed into a powerful economic engine in its own right. As a new pilgrimage destination, it would attract a continuous stream of visitors, generating income for local inns, taverns, and vendors for generations, a long-term return on a monumental investment. The sheer scale of capital required to initiate and sustain these projects could not be managed from a single strongbox. It demanded a more sophisticated system for moving and protecting immense wealth. A merchant at a medieval fair approaches a knight of the Templar order not for protection but for a financial service. He deposits a heavy purse of coins and receives in return a carefully inscribed letter. This single piece of parchment, bearing the order's distinctive seal, is more valuable than the gold itself, for it can be presented at a Templar commandery in a distant city and redeemed for its full value. This was the birth of international finance, and its most trusted pioneers were not kings or moneylenders, but men of the church. In an era where the act of lending money for interest was formally discouraged by papal decree, religious institutions masterfully navigated a complex moral and economic landscape. They found ways to facilitate commerce without technically violating these guidelines, often by charging administrative fees for the service of handling and transferring money, rather than interest on a loan. This subtle distinction allowed the Church, particularly the military orders and monastic networks, to become the indispensable bankers of the age. The services they offered were revolutionary. A pilgrim concerned about travel risks could deposit their life savings at a local monastery and journey with a letter of credit, a system that made long voyages feasible for ordinary people. Monarchs and nobles utilized the Templars' vast, fortified networks to store their crowns and treasures in vaults far more secure than any royal castle. The most sophisticated service was the international transfer of papal taxes, known as Peter's Pence. Funds collected from across Europe were not physically shipped to Rome, a difficult and impractical endeavor. Instead, local churches would deposit the revenue with a Templar house. The order would then issue a credit to the papal treasury in Rome, effectively moving immense sums across the continent through a ledger entry, a system of trust and accounting that predated modern banking by centuries. The Templars, in particular, became financiers to the highest levels of power. They managed the royal treasury of the French crown, essentially functioning as the kingdom's central bank. The order's own vast and scattered assets, from lands to castles, served as the unshakable foundation that backed all of these financial agreements. Behind this entire operation was a level of administrative genius cultivated in the quiet scriptoria of monasteries. Monks developed sophisticated accounting methods, meticulously recording every transaction in detailed ledgers that tracked the complex flow of resources across nations. Consider the immense influence this represented. When King Philip IV of France needed to finance his military campaigns, it was the Templars who provided the funds, effectively making a religious order the creditor to a throne. This relationship illustrates a profound irony, that an institution dedicated to spiritual purity became the central hub for the very economic activities its own doctrines sometimes questioned. How does an organization reconcile its sacred mission with the practical demands of managing an empire of wealth? The answer lies in this financial acumen, which was not a side venture but a core component of its enduring influence. This sophisticated machinery for moving resources would be useless, however, without a constant stream of raw material, and the Church developed one final, deeply personal revenue stream that tapped directly into the hopes and concerns of every soul in Christendom. A lone rider on a muddy track through the Alps carries a sealed leather pouch, its contents more valuable than any single parcel of goods. Inside are coins, thousands of them, collected from the hearths of England, destined for the treasury in Rome. This was Peter's Pence, an annual financial tribute that transformed the abstract authority of the papacy into a tangible, continent-spanning revenue stream. Unlike the tithe which supported the local church, this was a direct contribution for the Pope himself, a powerful demonstration of the Church's role as a true transnational fiscal authority. In kingdoms like England, Poland, and Sweden, every household, from the wealthiest merchant to the most humble cottager, was expected to offer 1 silver penny each year. While a single penny seems modest, multiplied across millions of homes, it created a formidable and predictable income. Records suggest that England alone sent the equivalent of several £100s of silver annually, a massive sum in the medieval economy that formed the financial bedrock of the papal court. The logistics of this system were a marvel of medieval administration. Local bishops acted as the collectors, gathering the coins from their parishes and consolidating them into a single, large shipment. The physical challenge of moving this bulk currency across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain was immense, filled with the risks of bandits and the simple perils of travel. This is where the financial networks of the military orders proved essential, as their secure commanderies often served as way stations for this important treasure. The politics of collection, however, could be even more complex than the roads. Monarchs sometimes resisted this outward flow of their kingdom's wealth, viewing it as a drain on their own resources and a challenge to their domestic control. The symbolic importance of Peter's Pence was immense. It was a direct and annual test of a kingdom's loyalty to Rome. When King John of England clashed with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope's most immediate and powerful tool was not an army, but an economic one. he placed England under an interdict and pressured the king by threatening the very collection of this contribution, leveraging financial flow to reinforce spiritual alignment. Can you conceive of the administrative consistency required to manage a tax that reached into the homes of millions across different languages and legal systems, year after year? This was not a sporadic donation drive, it was a sophisticated, recurring revenue model. The funds gathered were not left idle, they were the lifeblood of the Papal States, used to support soldiers, maintain roads, and administer justice across the Pope's own territories in central Italy. Within the Curia, the papal government, this steady income financed everything from diplomatic envoys to the copying of important documents, enabling the Church to project its influence far beyond the walls of St. Peter's Basilica. This river of silver pennies, flowing from countless villages to a single center, helped fund the very machinery of spiritual diplomacy, proving that faith could indeed build and sustain an institution with its own economy, its own borders, and its own intricate systems of influence. A lone rider carrying a sealed letter was the lifeblood of a system far more advanced than any royal postal service. His journey between a Cistercian abbey in Yorkshire and its daughter house in Burgundy was not merely a spiritual connection, it was a vital economic artery. Inside that pouch were detailed financial instructions, reports on local harvests, and sensitive market intelligence about the price of wool in Flanders. This was the horizontal integration of the medieval world, where religious orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, and Franciscans operated as the first truly international corporations. They shared a centralized rule, a single guiding document for spiritual life, yet they empowered decentralized economic operations that spanned the continent. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries earlier, laid the foundation for this entire structure with a simple, powerful command. It instructed each monastery to be arranged so that all necessities like water, mills, and gardens are contained within the enclosure, so the monks need not wander outside. This ideal of self-sufficiency, when scaled across hundreds of monasteries, did not create isolated communities. It forged a resilient and interdependent network. This system functioned with remarkable sophistication. Specialized knowledge was a currency shared freely among the houses, a new method for draining marshland perfected by Cistercian brothers in one country would be documented and sent to their counterparts abroad, dramatically improving agricultural yields everywhere. Individual abbeys developed deep specialties, some becoming renowned centers for winemaking, others for copying manuscripts, and still others for breeding the finest warhorses in Europe. To coordinate this vast enterprise, the orders held annual chapters, great meetings where abbots from across the region would gather. Here, they did not only discuss spiritual matters, they reviewed ledgers, settled disputes over property, and made collective financial decisions, governing their economic activities with a consistency that secular rulers could only envy. The advantages of this network were profound. By holding assets in different kingdoms, they diversified their risk. A local famine or conflict would not cripple the entire order. They could transfer capital and knowledge with an efficiency impossible in the fragmented feudal world, moving surplus funds from a wealthy Italian house to fund construction at a new foundation on the German frontier. Most importantly, they cultivated a unified identity that inspired universal trust. A donation made to a Cistercian abbey was not a gift to a single monastery. It was an investment in a pan-European institution known for its discipline and economic insight. This is perfectly illustrated by the Cistercian wool trade. Abbeys in the remote hills of England and Wales raised massive flocks of sheep. Their raw wool was collected, graded for quality, and then transported through the order's own secure channels to great commercial fairs in places like Champagne, where it was sold in bulk to Italian merchants. This was not a haphazard process. It was a fully integrated supply chain from pasture to market, managed by a religious corporation centuries before the term was ever coined. When you look at the seamless global operations of a modern multinational company, with its standardized practices and international logistics, can you see the ghost of this monastic network, perfected not for profit, but for the purpose of sustaining a spiritual mission? This interconnected system became the most powerful vehicle of its age for sharing economic practices and building resources on a previously unimaginable scale. The quiet scratching of a quill in a scriptorium was the sound of intellectual capital being minted. In a world where literacy was a rare and powerful tool, the Church held a near-total monopoly on the written word. This control over knowledge was not merely a cultural achievement, it was a foundational pillar of its economic and political strength. While kings and lords ruled by the sword, the Church governed through the pen, training the scribes, lawyers, and administrators who kept the entire feudal system functioning. Historians note that the ability to read, write, and maintain complex accounts was a marketable skill of immense value, concentrated almost exclusively within the ecclesiastical world. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of influence. Monastic schools and, later, universities became the exclusive training grounds for the bureaucrats needed to run both royal governments and the Church's own vast estates. A young man educated in a cathedral school did not just learn grammar and rhetoric. He was being prepared for a career that could place him at the right hand of a bishop or a count, handling sensitive legal documents and managing large-scale finances. This process cultivated a loyal, educated elite whose primary frame of reference was the intellectual tradition of the Church itself, ensuring its doctrines and authority were woven into the very fabric of secular governance. The economic functions of these centers of learning were direct and multifaceted. The production of books in the scriptorium was a painstaking, high-value industry. A single illuminated manuscript, with its intricate illustrations and flawless Latin script, could take a team of scribes and artists years to complete. Such works were not just spiritual treasures, they were incredibly expensive commodities commissioned by kings and nobles for princely sums, adding another significant revenue stream to monastic coffers. Beyond creating books, these institutions sold education itself. The University of Bologna, for instance, grew from its initial focus on canon law into a magnet for thousands of students from across Europe. These young scholars brought with them their tuition fees and their living expenses, transforming the city into a bustling academic hub and providing a massive, sustained boost to the local economy. Wealthy families paid handsomely to secure educated careers for their sons, whether in the Church or in royal service, viewing it as a crucial investment in their family's future standing. Can you grasp the strategic power of an institution that not only creates the laws but also educates every lawyer and scribe who interprets them? This intellectual dominance made the Church an indispensable partner to every throne, its scholars producing the theological and legal texts that justified the feudal hierarchy and its own place within it. The quiet work in the scriptorium, therefore, was as vital to building the Church's empire of wealth as any tithe barn or manor field, for it controlled the most powerful resource of all, the means to record, justify, and perpetuate its own authority. That quiet scratching of the quill could draft a letter that would bring a king to his knees. Behind the spiritual authority of the Church lay a more pragmatic form of power, one built on its unrivaled financial resources. A cardinal robed in scarlet stands not in a chapel but in a royal council chamber. He is not there to pray but to negotiate, and his most potent bargaining chip is not a theological argument, but the vast treasury he represents. The Church's wealth was its primary instrument of soft power, a tool that allowed it to shape the political landscape of Europe for centuries. Consider the investiture controversy, a dramatic struggle between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. On the surface, it was a conflict over who had the right to appoint bishops, but at its core, it was a battle for control of immense revenues and territories. The bishops were not just spiritual leaders, they were powerful feudal lords who controlled land, collected taxes, and commanded soldiers. Whoever appointed them controlled their wealth and loyalty. When the emperor refused to yield, the pope's response was not a call to arms, but a financial and spiritual sanction. He excommunicated Henry, a move that effectively released all of the emperor's subjects from their oaths of allegiance and threatened the stability of his entire reign. The correspondence between them reveals the stark reality of this power play. The Pope wrote of his duty to guide souls, while the emperor, facing rebellion from his own nobles, was forced into a dramatic act of penance, standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside a papal castle, asking for forgiveness. This was not merely a spiritual victory, it was a masterclass in leveraging institutional authority to secure economic and political control. The tools at the Church's disposal were both subtle and direct. It could fund allies in a conflict, acting as the banker for one side to ensure a favorable outcome. It could mediate disputes between warring nobles, often with a vested financial interest in a peaceful resolution that protected its own widespread properties. Even the sacred ceremony of coronation was a point of leverage, as the Church's blessing was essential for a monarch's legitimacy. Perhaps the most powerful financial lever was the Church's role as a primary creditor to crowns. A king like Philip IV of France might amass enormous debts to the Knights Templar to finance his wars. This dependency created a relationship of profound influence, where the Church could quietly shape royal policy through the promise of new loans or the concern over existing obligations. The flow of tithes from an entire kingdom could be influenced, and the vast funds collected for Crusades could be directed toward projects that reinforced papal authority. Can any modern institution claim such a direct and multifaceted hold over the political destiny of nations, not through force of arms but through control of capital and conscience? This deep political entanglement was the ultimate safeguard, ensuring that the economic interests of the Church were protected at the very highest levels of secular power, weaving its financial empire into the immutable fabric of medieval life itself. The long columns of knights and pilgrims marching east represented a river of silver flowing in the opposite direction. The Crusades were the single most expensive enterprise the medieval Church ever sponsored, a breathtaking financial undertaking that required mobilizing the entire economy of faith. Historians calculate that the cost of equipping and transporting a single knight to the Holy Land could exceed his family's annual income many times over, a burden that drove kings and nobles to seek funding from the only institution with the necessary capital. To meet this colossal demand, the Church orchestrated the first continent-wide fundraising campaigns in European history. Special taxes were levied, most famously the Saladin tithe, a 10% levy on all movable property and revenue, a direct precursor to modern income taxes. This was not a request for donations, it was a mandatory financial contribution for a holy war, enforced with both spiritual and secular authority. The economic motivations for the Church were as complex as the religious ones. By channeling the aggressive energy of Europe's warrior class outward, it hoped to reduce internal conflicts that disrupted its vast landholdings. Gaining a foothold in the strategically vital Levant promised influence over the lucrative spice and silk trades flowing from the east. And uniting Christendom under a single papal-led campaign served to consolidate the Pope's authority over rival kings and emperors. The initial successes created new economic realities. Resources from captured cities like Jerusalem flowed back to Europe, while the establishment of Crusader states created fresh revenue streams from new lands and loyal bishoprics. For many participating nobles, the journey was a financially devastating gamble. To fund their expeditions, they were often forced to mortgage their ancestral estates, and the primary institution with the liquidity to make such loans was invariably the Church. This created a profound irony, where the quest to reclaim the Holy Land resulted in the transfer of vast European territories from the nobility into the hands of the ecclesiastical lenders. The economic shockwaves extended far beyond the battlefield. Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa experienced an economic boom, building and leasing vast fleets of transport ships at staggering costs, their financial demands sometimes steering the course of history itself. This was made tragically clear during the Fourth Crusade. Unable to pay the Venetians the full sum for their fleet, the Crusader army was diverted from its sacred mission to instead attack the Christian city of Constantinople. This act, driven more by cold, hard Venetian financial calculations than by religious zeal, exposed the fragile balance between spiritual ideals and material costs. Can a war for souls remain pure when its engines are powered by such immense and unforgiving debt? The financial legacy of these campaigns reshaped Europe, accelerating the use of money, strengthening international trade networks, and leaving the Church both enriched by new assets and burdened by the complex moral and economic consequences of its most ambitious project. The gold leaf on a newly completed altarpiece did more than catch the light. It captured the attention and the donations of every pilgrim who saw it. This was art as a strategic financial instrument, a calculated investment designed to generate spiritual and economic returns for generations. The patronage system was the engine behind this cultural economy, where popes, cardinals, and wealthy abbots competed to commission the most breathtaking works from the finest artists of the age. They were not merely patrons of the arts, they were the primary sponsors of the entire Renaissance, directing a river of ecclesiastical wealth into the studios of painters, sculptors, and architects. The contracts drawn up were as meticulous as any modern business agreement. An agreement between the painter Giotto and his patrons for the Scrovegni Chapel specified the exact quality and quantity of materials to be used, most notably the brilliant ultramarine blue made from crushed lapis lazuli, a pigment more expensive than gold by weight. The artist was not just paid for his time, he was given a budget for the raw materials of ore itself. The economic logic was both brilliant and straightforward. A spectacular fresco cycle or a revered relic could transform an obscure local church into a major pilgrimage destination, and where pilgrims traveled, money followed. A constant stream of visitors meant a continuous flow of offerings into the collection chests, along with revenue for the local inns, taverns, and vendors who serviced the travel routes. Pilgrims would purchase lead or tin badges depicting the site's sacred art or holy relic, wearing them as proof of their journey and effectively becoming walking advertisements for the church. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of prestige and profit. The initial capital investment in art and architecture attracted more visitors, which increased revenue, which funded even more ambitious artistic projects, further enhancing the church's reputation. The Scrovegni Chapel stands as a perfect example. It was funded by Enrico Scrovegni, a wealthy banker seeking spiritual redemption for his financial dealings. His magnificent patronage, which hired Giotto to cover the walls in one of the most influential fresco cycles in history, did not just address his personal legacy, it transformed his resources into an enduring cultural landmark that still draws visitors and their contributions centuries later. Can you see how a masterpiece functioned as a stable store of value in an age before stock markets, a tangible asset that appreciated in cultural capital with every passing year. This fusion of aesthetics and economics created the most enduring monuments we have to the Church's power, stone and pigment translated into both faith and financial stability. Yet this vast and interconnected system of wealth, stretching from the humblest tithe to the most glorious cathedral, could not exist without the silent, relentless work of administration that held it all together. The road to Santiago was a river of souls and a highway of commerce. Each year, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, from humble peasants to penitent nobles, set out on the long journey to the shrine of St. James in Compostela. Their footsteps wore deep grooves into the stone pathways of northern Spain, a physical testament to a spiritual migration that reshaped the economy of an entire continent. This was not a solitary quest, it was a highly organized, church-sanctioned industry, a form of mass travel centuries before the term existed. Historians estimate that in peak years, major destinations like Rome or Canterbury could see well over 100,000 visitors, a staggering influx that transformed quiet cathedral towns into bustling cosmopolitan hubs. To support this endless stream of travelers, a specialized infrastructure blossomed along the main routes. Monasteries and local entrepreneurs established hostels, known as hospices, offering basic shelter for the night. Taverns and food stalls lined the approaches to major shrines, catering to weary travelers. A vibrant market for personal tokens flourished, with pilgrims purchasing lead badges depicting St. James or tiny scallop shells, the symbol of the Compostela pilgrimage, to sew onto their hats as proof of their completed journey. The Church did not merely observe this economy, it actively managed and monetized every step. At the journey's end, pilgrims received an official certificate, a compostela, for a small fee, serving as their spiritual receipt. They could also pay for special masses to be sung for their intentions or receive blessings from clergy, all for a designated offering. The management of the pilgrimage was a masterclass in vertical integration. Monastic orders controlled the key stopping points, where great churches housed revered relics that pilgrims were expected to visit and donate to. They operated hospitals to care for those who fell ill along the way. Guidebooks were produced, the most famous being the 12th century Codex Calixtinus, which advised pilgrims on everything from the holiest sites to visit to which local rivers had unsafe water. This document functioned as a combination spiritual manual and travel brochure, carefully directing the flow of people and their wealth to sanctioned locations. Nowhere was this economic transformation more dramatic than in Canterbury. After the passing of Thomas Becket, the cathedral became one of the richest pilgrimage sites in Europe. The town's entire economy recalibrated to serve the visitors. Innkeepers, candle makers, sellers of pilgrim badges, and even the guides who led tours to the memorial site all thrived on this continuous stream of devoted commerce. The cathedral itself grew wealthy from the offerings left at Becket's shimmering shrine, a chest that reportedly had to be emptied multiple times each day. Can we see in these ancient journeys a precursor to the modern experience, where a search for meaning is so often channeled through a well-worn path of hotels, gift shops, and curated experiences? This relentless flow of pilgrims did not just fund the Church, it created a circulatory system for wealth, connecting the most remote villages to the grandest cathedrals in a single, faith-driven marketplace. The word usury carries the weight of a 1,000-year-old condemnation. A papal bull from the 12th century declared that a person associated with this practice could be considered infamous and might be denied traditional rights if they did not make things right. Yet in the quiet corners of that same century, a bishop might privately review a ledger, his personal resources connected to a merchant's voyage to Alexandria. This was the great contradiction at the heart of the Church's financial system. a tension between sacred teaching and practical need that would eventually help shape modern finance. The early church fathers left little room for debate. Saint Ambrose stated that to demand usury from any person was to treat them unfairly, describing it as taking advantage of a neighbor's difficult situation. This restriction was rooted in ancient texts and the classical view of money as a simple means of exchange, something that could not and should not grow on its own. For a very long time, the rule was firm for the clergy, and the ideal was encouraged for all believers. But as Europe's economy began to awaken, a new challenge appeared. How could trade flourish? How could cities develop without the essential flow of credit? Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas grappled with this very issue. He supported the traditional prohibition but introduced an important distinction. He suggested that while asking for interest on a basic loan was not permitted, someone providing funds could rightly receive payment if their assistance caused them a real setback or if they accepted a true part in the venture's uncertainty. This was the subtle opening in the established view. From this space emerged a number of thoughtful financial arrangements created to work within these boundaries. One was the census, an agreement that resembled the purchase of a future revenue source more than a simple loan. Another was the partnership, or commenda, where a person supplied funds for a commercial journey, embracing the chance of losing everything in return for a portion of the possible gains. Interest was not being demanded, the reasoning went. It was being received through mutual commercial spirit. This established a unique social pattern. Jewish financiers, working under special permissions from rulers and religious leaders, often provided needed credit for everyday people. They carried out a vital role in the economy, yet their standing was often uncertain, dependent on the favor of authorities who could change their status. At the same time, within Christian society itself, the adaptations became more accepted. The church itself started to obtain large sums, and financial houses appeared in Italy that thoughtfully described their charges as fees for delayed settlement or as payment for the uncertainty and effort of managing funds. The most revealing case is the rise of the Medici family. They became the bankers to the Pope himself, overseeing the immense resources of the Holy See and supporting the very institution that formerly questioned their central activity. Their achievement was a quiet witness to a changing situation where teaching had adjusted to new realities. Can a principle stay untouched when it must operate in a complex world? The Church's long, thoughtful path from strict forbearance to understanding was not a defeat, but a practical development. It permitted the institution to support its own goals while offering the intellectual structure that made possible the commercial awakening of the Middle Ages. This thoughtful engagement with commerce was perhaps one of its most lasting economic contributions, forming the very ideas of investment and uncertainty that support our world today. Empty villages stood silent beneath a cold sky, their fields lying untended and their hearths gone dark. The events of the 14th century did not just carry away lives, they erased the very foundations of the medieval economy. This was the ultimate test for the Church's financial empire, a catastrophe that struck at both its sources of revenue and the people who managed them. The scale of change was almost beyond comprehension, with some regions losing half of their population. Tithes vanished as entire families were no longer there, and the intricate networks of manors and granges faced a sudden, devastating labor shortage. The old order, so carefully built over centuries, was fracturing. With fewer workers to till the soil and tend the flocks, the Church's agricultural output plummeted. Monasteries that had once generated immense surpluses now struggled to feed their own communities. The immediate financial impact was a collapse in revenue, as the steady river of tithes and manorial dues slowed to a trickle. Yet, in a difficult economic twist, the same disaster also triggered inflation. The overall amount of silver coin in circulation remained largely the same, but it was now concentrated among fewer people. Survivors found their labor was suddenly in high demand, and they could command much higher wages for their work. This presented a profound dilemma for ecclesiastical landlords. Some monastic houses, facing the reality of empty fields, made the pragmatic choice to raise wages to attract the scarce workers they desperately needed. Others, clinging to the past, faced financial difficulty as their lands lay fallow. Secular authorities tried to resist this new economic reality. In England, the Crown enacted the Statute of Labourers, a law designed to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels and force people to accept work for the old pay. This attempt to legislate against the forces of supply and demand was largely unenforceable, creating widespread social tension. For the Church, the crisis was not merely financial, it was also spiritual. How could an institution that promised divine protection explain such overwhelming change? This crisis of faith inevitably affected the flow of traditional donations, as some people questioned the very foundations of the establishment they had supported for so long. Yet, in the shadow of this uncertainty, new forms of devotion also flourished. Anxious patrons, seeking direct intercession with the divine, sometimes channeled their wealth toward new religious movements or specific orders known for their extreme piety. The Carthusian monks, for instance, saw a significant surge in post-plague bequests. Their reputation for austere living and constant prayer made them attractive spiritual intermediaries for those hoping to secure a place in the next world. Can any modern corporation plan for a scenario where a third of its customers and half its management vanish almost overnight? The Church's empire of wealth was forced to adapt, its response a messy combination of desperate pragmatism and renewed spiritual outreach. The world had been turned upside down, and the institution that had built the old economy now had to find a new footing within a completely restructured one. Gold leaf glimmered on an altarpiece in one room, while in the next a ledger lay open, its pages filled with precise columns of debits and credits. The Medici Palace in Florence was a perfect symbol of a new era, where the worlds of high finance and deep faith were no longer separate but had become inextricably fused. The great Italian banking families of the 15th century, names like the Medici, the Pazzi, and the Chigi, emerged as the indispensable financial partners to the papacy itself. They were the engineers of a new monetary system, managing the complex international cash flows that the old monastic networks could no longer handle alone. In a personal letter, Lorenzo de' Medici wrote plainly to his agent in Rome, instructing him to advance a substantial sum to the papal court for an upcoming military campaign, a transaction that secured not only interest but immense political favor. This was the reality of the relationship. Loans bought access, and access translated into power. The role these families played was vast and systematic. They acted as the Church's international treasury, collecting papal taxes and tithes from every corner of Europe through a sophisticated network of branch banks. A French bishop's contribution could be deposited in Lyon and, through the magic of a bill of exchange, become spendable capital for the Pope in Rome without a single coin ever needing to cross the Alps. This system of paper credit was revolutionary, drastically reducing the risk and cost of moving money. The banks also provided the Holy See with enormous loans to fund everything from major initiatives to the lavish building projects that defined the Renaissance, effectively becoming the supporters behind both the Vatican's spiritual endeavors and its cultural legacy. They even managed the day-to-day finances of the Papal States, governing its economy as de facto ministers of finance. The profits from these services were immense, built on fees, favorable exchange rates, and the interest cleverly disguised within their contracts. Yet the risks were as colossal as the rewards. The dramatic collapse of the Peruzzi and Bardi banking houses in the previous century served as a stark warning. These Florentine giants had extended massive loans to King Edward III of England to finance his military campaigns in France. When the English crown defaulted on its debts, it triggered a chain reaction of financial distress that reshaped the Italian banking world. This event laid bare the delicate interconnectedness of church and state finance, where a conflict between two kings could unsettle the financial pillars of the papacy. What happens when the institution that holds the keys to heaven also becomes entangled in the high-stakes game of international lending, where a single royal default could challenge its fiscal stability? This intimate partnership between the papal court and the banking families represented the absolute peak of the Church's integration into the emerging capitalist order, a zenith of power and peril achieved not from the altar but from the counting house. A hush fell over the cathedral as the bishop raised a golden reliquary high above the altar. Inside, encased in crystal, lay a small, dark fragment of wood, said to be from the very cross upon which the world was redeemed. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a surge of devotion that translated directly into the ringing of coins dropped into waiting chests. This powerful scene was repeated countless times across medieval Europe, for the trade in sacred relics was not merely a matter of faith, but a sophisticated and highly lucrative economic sector, meticulously guided by the Church. Historians have long noted the astonishing volume of these objects in circulation. One witty observer from the 16th century remarked that if all the purported fragments of the true cross were gathered together, they would fill a large ship, while the various heads of John the Baptist could populate a small gathering. This proliferation was not an accident, it was a function of intense demand. A single, authenticated relic could transform an obscure local church into a major pilgrimage destination, generating a continuous stream of revenue for centuries. The process of bringing a relic to wider attention was a careful one. Objects were acquired through various means, from diplomatic gifts between rulers to the sanctioned transfer of personal items from early Christian sites. Less officially, there was a vibrant underground economy of relic acquisition, where monks might seek a saintly artifact from a rival monastery, viewing it not as a crime but as a pious act for the greater glory of their own community. Once acquired, authentication was everything. A bishop or even the Pope himself would examine the object, often relying on miraculous signs or long-standing tradition to validate its holiness. This official certification was the crucial step that transformed a simple artifact into a spiritual asset of immense value. The economic life of a relic began with its presentation. It was housed in a reliquary, a container often crafted from the finest gold, silver, and precious gems by master artisans. These lavish cases were not just decorative, they were a physical manifestation of the relic's significance, a deliberate investment designed to inspire awe and, consequently, more generous donations from pilgrims. Viewing the relic itself was rarely free. Pilgrims paid a fee to approach the altar, with additional offerings expected for the special privilege of touching or even kissing the reliquary. The financial benefits extended far beyond the church doors. A major relic attracted thousands of visitors, supporting a local economy of inns, taverns, food vendors, and souvenir sellers, all paying their own dues and taxes to the ecclesiastical authorities who govern the town. In times of severe financial distress, the ultimate spiritual asset could even be leveraged. Entire relics were sometimes entrusted to wealthy nobles or bankers as collateral for large loans. or even transferred to another church in a more prosperous region, a clear demonstration of their function as negotiable spiritual capital. The most spectacular example is the translation of the relics of the three Magi from Milan to Cologne in the 12th century. Their arrival, orchestrated by the Holy Roman Emperor, immediately established Cologne Cathedral as one of the premier pilgrimage sites in Europe, a spiritual powerhouse whose wealth and influence were built directly upon the gifts of those who came to honor the wise kings. How does a society determine the price of a miracle or the market value of divine connection? This entire system, from authentication to display, revealed the Church's unparalleled ability to create, regulate, and sustain a spiritual economy where the currency was faith itself, and the treasures were objects believed to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. The air inside a monastery was thick with the earthy scent of fermenting grain, the rhythmic clatter of looms, and the soft scratch of quills on parchment. This was not a retreat from the world of commerce, but a hive of diversified industry where spiritual devotion fueled remarkable economic innovation. Monasteries transformed into powerful production centers, actively developing and sometimes monopolizing entire trades. The rule of Saint Benedict itself commanded that monks must live by the labor of their hands, framing every task from farming to crafting as an act of worship. This spiritual mandate for work created an environment ripe for commercial enterprise. One of their most famous and enduring industries was brewing. Communities like the Trappists perfected the art of beer making, not for revelry but for sustenance, creating nutritious beverages that were safer to drink than local water and could be consumed during periods of fasting. Their recipes, honed over centuries, resulted in a product of such consistent quality that the monastic brand became synonymous with excellence, allowing these beers to command premium prices in local markets and beyond. Alongside brewing, monastic vineyards flourished. Orders like the Benedictines and Cistercians became master vintners, cultivating vast tracts of land for winemaking. The wine they produced served a dual purpose. It was essential for the celebration of the Mass, and the surplus became a valuable commodity for trade, funding their daily operations and expansive building projects. The quality of these monastic goods was no accident. It was the result of focused experimentation and technological advancement. Monks were pioneers in improving water mill technology, harnessing river power not just for grinding grain, but for fulling cloth in their textile workshops and operating forge hammers in their metalworking shops. This vertical integration was a key to their success. A Cistercian abbey, for instance, might control the entire production chain for wool, from the sheep grazing on its own hillsides to the washing, carding, and spinning done by lay brothers and local workers, right through to the weaving on its own looms. These lay brothers were the engine of this industrial complex, skilled individuals who took vows but focused on manual labor, freeing the ordained monks for liturgical duties while ensuring the monastery's economic activities ran with professional efficiency. At great international markets like the Champagne fairs, carts laden with monastic wool, wine, and meticulously copied manuscripts would sit alongside exotic spices and silks, their quality and the trusted reputation of the monastic brand making them a major attraction for merchants from across Europe. Can you see the silhouette of a modern multinational corporation in this self-sufficient, vertically integrated community, where a shared rule book governed both prayer and production? This relentless industrial activity provided a steady, diversified income stream that made the Church not just a landowner, but an industrial powerhouse, its economic resilience woven as tightly as the cloth on its own looms. A king's treasurer stares in frustration at two separate papal bulls, each demanding the annual payment of Peter's pence, each sealed by a different man claiming to be the one true pope. This was the financial reality of the Great Western Schism, a 40-year tear in the fabric of the Church that strained its treasury to the breaking point. From 1378, Europe was plunged into a crisis of authority as first two, and later three, rival popes reigned simultaneously from Rome, Avignon, and eventually Pisa. Each maintained a full papal court with its own cardinals, diplomats, and most critically, its own tax collectors, all competing for the same finite pool of ecclesiastical revenue. The foundational income streams that had built the Church's influence, like the tithe and Peter's pence, were thrown into disarray. A local bishop, unsure which claimant held true spiritual authority, might delay sending funds. A monarch could strategically withhold payment to leverage political favor, pledging loyalty to one pope while quietly negotiating with another. This created profound uncertainty and shortfalls, as the same coin could not be paid to two masters. The financial pressure to sustain these parallel governments was immense. Expert analysis shows that simply maintaining two full papal courts, with their elaborate ceremonies and extensive bureaucracies, effectively doubled the baseline administrative costs. To cover these soaring expenses, the rival papacies turned to increasingly aggressive fundraising efforts. The sale of church offices, a practice known as simony, became widespread. Positions from local parish priest to powerful bishopric were openly offered to the highest bidder, ensuring that leadership was filled not by the most devout, but by the wealthiest, who then sought to recoup their investment through their own local taxation. This situation deeply affected the spiritual credibility of the entire institution. When confidence in the leadership wavered, the steady flow of voluntary donations that had always supplemented official taxes began to diminish as the faithful grew disillusioned with a hierarchy seemingly more interested in wealth than spiritual guidance. The eventual resolution of the schism came at a staggering price itself. The Council of Constance, which finally restored a single pope to Rome in 1418, was a monumental diplomatic and financial undertaking. For years, the city hosted thousands of prelates, theologians, and their extensive entourages. The cost of lobbying, of securing favorable votes, and of simply housing and feeding this international assembly was astronomical, a final, massive expenditure required to mend a self-inflicted wound. Can any institution, no matter how wealthy, truly afford a conflict that forces it to compete with itself for its own resources? The Great Western Schism did more than create theological confusion. It fractured the centralized financial control the papacy had meticulously built over centuries, exposing a deep vulnerability. The very machinery of influence that had empowered the Church to crown emperors was now being strained by its own divided leadership, leaving a weakened institution to face a world that was rapidly changing around it. A bishop's voice echoes from the pulpit, not in apology for his cathedral's grandeur, but in its defense. He proclaims that every acre of land, every golden chalice, is not owned by the Church, but held in sacred trust. This powerful idea, divine stewardship, became the ideological bedrock that transformed vast material accumulation from a contradiction into a holy duty. Influential thinkers like St. Augustine had laid the groundwork centuries before, writing extensively on the proper use of wealth, arguing that possessions were lawful only when directed toward a greater good. This theology reframed the entire economic enterprise. Wealth was not for luxury, but a tool, a spiritual instrument for three sacred purposes. It enabled charity, feeding the hungry and caring for the ill in a world with no social safety net. It facilitated worship, raising breathtaking cathedrals that lifted the soul toward heaven, and it funded mission, sending preachers to distant lands to spread the faith. This framework was elaborated in papal letters and sermons across the ages. One key argument held that the Church triumphant, as the visible body of Christ on earth required a certain material splendor to reflect the glory of the divine. To strip the church of its assets, another line of reasoning went, would render it destitute and dangerously dependent on the whims of secular princes, corrupting its spiritual independence. Yet this very justification was perpetually challenged from within. Reform movements, most notably the Franciscans, arose to champion a life of apostolic poverty, directly questioning whether such immense wealth was compatible with the simple life of its founder. They presented a powerful counter-narrative that resonated deeply with many. The ideal steward, however, was often embodied by figures like Pope Gregory I, known to history as Gregory the Great. During a difficult period of widespread sickness in Rome, he famously mobilized the entire resources of the papal treasury, organizing not just prayers but systematic food distribution and medical care, transforming doctrine into direct action. Can the pursuit of spiritual goals ever be entirely separate from the material means required to achieve them? Every modern institution, from philanthropic foundations to global corporations, must also articulate a purpose for its wealth and influence, a reason for its existence that the world will accept. For the medieval church, this sophisticated theology of stewardship was that essential justification, the moral compass that guided its economic empire and, for centuries, secured the consent of the faithful. Royal commissioners rode into the cloister, their ledgers and seals a stark contrast to the quiet prayers of the monks. This was the beginning of the end for the medieval church's economic empire in England. Over the course of the 1530s, King Henry VIII's government systematically disbanded every monastery, nunnery, and friary in the realm, an event known as the Dissolution of the Monasteries. It was the single greatest act of asset transfer in European history, a forced inventory that revealed the remarkable wealth the Church had gathered over nearly 1,000 years. The official reports sent back to the Crown read like treasure maps, detailing vast stores of gold and silver plate, jeweled reliquaries, and chests filled with coin. The lands alone were the real prize, encompassing nearly a quarter of all the cultivated acreage in England and Wales. The legal mechanism was a series of parliamentary acts that first targeted the smaller houses under the pretext of reform, then moved steadily to dismantle the great abbeys. The economic impact was immediate and revolutionary. A colossal wave of capital and property flowed to the crown, solving the king's financial challenges at a stroke and permanently reshaping the social landscape. The long-term consequence was a profound social revolution. The crown quickly sold off these vast estates to pay for its military ventures and to reward its supporters. This created a new landed gentry, a class of wealthy landowners whose title and fortune were directly tied to the king's break with Rome, giving them a powerful vested interest in the success of the Protestant Reformation. Their loyalty was no longer to a distant pope but to the monarch who had made them rich. The personal impact on those who lived there was deeply felt. Monks and nuns were pensioned off or moved on with little more than they could carry, their lifelong homes and communities dissolved. The local economies that had depended on monastic industries from wool production to brewing were thrown into disarray. The architectural loss was profound, as magnificent abbeys like revolts and fountains were systematically stripped of their lead roofs and valuable fittings, then left as sources for local building stone, their grandeur fading into the landscape we see today. The story of Glastonbury Abbey serves as a telling example. It was one of the oldest and wealthiest religious houses in England. When the commissioners arrived, its elderly abbot, Richard Whiting, initially complied. But he was later accused of concealing some of the abbey's treasures and was swiftly tried. His passing on the nearby Tor served as a clear signal against resistance. The abbey's immense lands were taken into royal hands, its treasures removed to the royal treasury, and its buildings left to time. Can a society truly prepare for the sudden collapse of an economic system that has structured life for centuries? The dissolution did not just transfer wealth from the church to the crown, it reshaped the very pillars of the medieval economic order in England, marking a decisive end to one era and the complex, transformative beginning of another. A bishop raises his hand in a crowded hall, not to give a blessing but to deliver a judgment. The case before him involves a disputed tract of farmland, and his ruling will be based not on the local lord's decree, but on a growing body of ecclesiastical rules known as canon law. This was a common scene across medieval Europe, where the church's courts wielded immense authority over the economic lives of millions. Beyond its vast estates and financial networks, the church's most enduring contribution to the empire of wealth may have been the invisible architecture of law it helped to build, shaping the very concepts of property, contracts, and fair exchange that would underpin the Western economic world. A foundational text, Gratian's Decretum, compiled in the 12th century, became the cornerstone of this system. It painstakingly organized centuries of papal rulings and theological writings into a coherent legal framework, addressing everyday economic concerns from the sanctity of oaths to the moral requirement of restitution. This was not an abstract exercise. It provided a common legal language for a fragmented continent, creating a predictable environment where commerce could begin to flourish across different kingdoms and customs. The jurisdiction of these church courts was surprisingly broad, touching the most pivotal moments in a person's economic life. They presided over marriage, which was not just a sacred union but a key transaction involving dowries and inheritance. They governed the execution of wills, and they held authority over any contract or business agreement that had been sworn with a sacred oath, making a person's spiritual word a legally enforceable bond. This influence directly fostered several key legal innovations. To manage its own far-flung properties, the Church developed early versions of the trust, a legal arrangement where assets were held and managed by one party for the benefit of another. This concept, designed to protect ecclesiastical lands, would later become a cornerstone of modern estate planning and corporate finance. The laws surrounding pious bequests were another powerful tool. Canon law made it legally straightforward for an individual to leave land or wealth directly to the church in their will, a process that often bypassed strict feudal inheritance rules designed to keep estates within a single noble family. This legal pathway ensured a continuous, voluntary flow of capital into the church's treasury from every level of society. Perhaps one of the most impactful economic principles championed by these courts was the idea of the just price. This was not a fixed number, but a philosophical standard asserting that the value of a good should reflect the labor required to produce it and a reasonable need for sustenance for the seller, not merely what a desperate buyer could be forced to pay in a moment of crisis. While difficult to enforce perfectly, this principle established a moral framework for commerce, challenging pure exploitation and laying early groundwork for concepts of economic fairness. How often do we consider the ancient legal structures that still silently govern our own transactions today, from the deed to a home to the terms of a business loan? The Church's legal innovations provided the essential stability and trust that allowed its own wealth to be secure, while simultaneously creating a more predictable and reliable environment for all commerce to grow. This legal legacy proved that true economic power is not just held in treasuries, but encoded in the very rules that organize society itself. The sermon thundered not from a cathedral pulpit but in the open air, as Jan Hus declared that a priest living in luxury was taking from those who had so little. His voice echoed a grievance felt across Europe, a deep and growing concern about an institution whose spiritual mission seemed at odds with its material splendor. For generations, the very economic engine that powered the Church also fueled powerful movements of reflection from theologians, monarchs, and common people alike. The English philosopher John Wycliffe argued passionately that the clergy should own nothing, stating that the higher the clergy rose in pride and worldly position, the more they fell in spiritual grace. His followers, the Lollards, took this message to the villagers, asking why they should support a wealthy church when they themselves struggled to survive. In times of social unrest, like the movement that swept through England in 1381, calls were made for church lands to be shared more widely among the people, revealing how daily hardship and spiritual reflection had become deeply connected. These concerns about church wealth centered on three powerful points. The first was the fear that great riches were distracting from the clergy's primary duty, turning guides for the spirit into managers of estates and collectors of dues. The second was the weight placed on ordinary people, the sense that the constant flow of tithes, fees, and offerings was a heavy load on those who could least afford it. The third, and perhaps most challenging to the established order, was the question of secular power, as kings grew increasingly uneasy with a rival authority that commanded its own soldiers, its own income, and its own courts. This questioning was not confined to lone voices. The Waldensians in France and Italy preached a return to simpler living, while monarchs like Philip IV of France directly confronted the papacy to assert royal control over church resources and appointments. Internal pressure for change mounted within the church itself. The Council of Constance, while resolving the Papal Schism, also grappled with calls to address the financial practices and administrative habits that had sparked so much unease. Yet one of the most severe responses to such challenges was the Albigensian campaign in the south of France. This military effort was officially launched to address a religious group whose beliefs differed from mainstream teaching, but it also served as a stark reminder to communities that questioned the material authority and taxation of the Catholic Church. The conflict showed how economic and spiritual influence were so deeply joined that a question about one was seen as a challenge to the other. How does any great institution navigate the delicate balance between the resources it needs to function and the ideals it exists to promote? This constant, simmering pressure for reform acted as a perpetual check, a reminder that the empire of wealth was built on a foundation that required not just economic skill, but the enduring trust of the community. A crown and a papal tiara sat on opposite sides of a great medieval scale, yet the balance consistently tipped toward the spiritual power. The economic relationship between the church and secular rulers was not an equal contest, for the church possessed structural advantages that allowed it to gather and hold wealth on a scale no single kingdom could match. At its peak, the Papal States alone generated an annual revenue that historians estimate rivaled the entire royal income of powerful kingdoms like France or England. While a king might collect feudal dues from his barons, the Church collected a perpetual tithe from every Christian soul in Western Europe. This created a financial foundation of remarkable stability. A king's revenue was tied to the length of his reign and the outcome of his military campaigns, a fluctuating cycle of conflict and succession. The Church, however, was an enduring institution. It continued across generations, it never faced succession taxes, and its sacred mission encouraged lasting investment in land, art, and architecture, assets that would grow in value for centuries rather than be spent in a single war. The Church's administrative system was simply more advanced. It maintained a continent-spanning network of educated clerics who could follow revenue from a village in Ireland to a market in Italy with careful records. This allowed it to move resources and arrange loans across political borders with a fluidity impossible for a monarch bound to his own territory. A French king could tax his subjects, but the Pope could also draw support from the French king's subjects, appealing to a sense of belonging that went beyond national identity. This international character made the Church's economic foundation remarkably secure. A secular ruler might take control of a local religious house, but to confront the entire financial system of the Church was to invite spiritual consequences and unrest from within his own faithful population. Yet there were boundaries to this influence, clearly shown in the encounter between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France. Philip, needing funds for his conflicts, claimed his right to tax the French clergy. Boniface answered with a decree opposing this step, affirming ultimate papal authority over every person. Philip's reply was not a debate of ideas but starkly pragmatic. He sent representatives to detain the elderly pope, a deeply difficult experience from which Boniface never fully regained his strength. The event demonstrated that while the Church's financial web was enormous, its physical presence could be exposed to a resolute national ruler with military force. What truly gives an institution lasting economic strength? The temporary power of a weapon or the enduring yield of conviction? This reflection shows that the most durable empires are constructed not on land alone, but on a bedrock of belief that continues beyond the rule of any single monarch. The clamor of a medieval market square, with its carefully negotiated prices and trusted letters of credit, did not simply fade away. It echoes today in the digital hum of a global stock exchange. The profound legacy of the Church's economic influence is not merely a historical curiosity, it is the very substructure of our modern financial world. While thinkers like Max Weber famously linked the rise of capitalism to a later Protestant work ethic, the essential groundwork was laid centuries earlier by the sprawling, sophisticated economic system of the medieval Catholic Church. Its institutional innovations provided the essential grammar for the language of modern commerce. This foundational role can be seen in the development of core financial concepts we now take for granted. The Church's international networks, particularly the Templars, cultivated the very idea of systemic trust and credit, proving that vast sums could move across continents based on the integrity of an institution's seal and ledger. The great religious orders, with their centralized rules and decentralized operations, functioned as the world's first true multinational organizations, perfecting a model of administration that would later be adopted by commercial enterprises. The monumental funding of cathedrals demonstrated the principles of large-scale project finance, pooling capital from countless sources for a single, long-term investment. Even the simple act of a pilgrim depositing coins in one city to retrieve them in another pioneered the system of international money transfer that defines our globalized economy. Consider the specific institutions the Church nurtured. The monastic focus on disciplined, productive labor and meticulous accounting created a culture where work was valued and record-keeping was a serious duty, values that would become central to the capitalist spirit. The Church's canon law courts, by enforcing contracts and upholding the importance of sworn oaths, provided the legal predictability necessary for commerce to flourish beyond local, personal trust. The dramatic changes to the monasteries in England did not erase this legacy, it accelerated it. By bringing vast tracts of land into the market, it created a new, market-oriented gentry class whose wealth was based on liquid capital and commercial agriculture, not inherited feudal status. Perhaps the most enduring contribution was the university system itself, a creation of the Church. These institutions produced the very architects of the new economy, the lawyers who drafted corporate charters and the accountants who developed double-entry bookkeeping. The intellectual capital first cultivated in ecclesiastical centers was later harnessed to manage the ledgers of merchant empires. So the next time you use a credit card, invest in a stock, or trust a corporation with your savings, look for the hidden medieval foundations. The framework of our entire financial world was not born in a vacuum. It was carefully, if unintentionally, assembled over centuries by an institution whose pursuit of a heavenly kingdom ultimately helped construct the economic one we inhabit today. From the quiet offering of a peasant's contribution to the intricate ledgers of international bankers, the medieval church constructed an economic system of breathtaking scale and sophistication. Its foundation rested upon four unshakable pillars. The first was the steady, systematic flow of tithes, a regular 10% levy that created a predictable stream of support from every level of society. The second was the strategic acquisition and masterful management of land, making the church the largest landholder in Europe and a powerhouse of agricultural production. The third was its pioneering role in banking and finance, where religious orders developed systems of credit and international money transfer that laid the groundwork for modern commerce. And the fourth was the support generated through spiritual services, from devotional offerings to the pilgrimage industry, transforming faith into a tangible source of institutional strength. Throughout this entire epoch, faith and finance were not separate forces, they were two sides of the same coin. Religious devotion provided the moral framework for this immense system, framing it as a form of stewardship, while also supplying the practical mechanisms that made it possible, from the collection of widespread donations to the spiritual encouragement of community support. The ultimate takeaway is clear: the medieval church was not merely a spiritual authority, it was a premodern institutional giant, a sophisticated economic force whose strategies in long-term investment, organizational management, and community loyalty remain strikingly relevant. As one historian notes, to understand the economic foundations of the church is to understand how any great idea can build an institution that outlasts kingdoms. It reveals the complex, often inseparable relationship between belief systems and economics, a dynamic that continues to shape our world today. We would love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Which aspect of the church's economic power did you find most surprising? The sheer scale of its landholdings, its role as an early financial center, or its ability to generate support through spiritual life? For more deep dives into the hidden histories that forged our modern world, be sure to subscribe. Our next exploration is already waiting.